Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at mysticism. What does it mean to be a mystic? My guest is James Tunney, a man of many talents who came to Albuquerque from Gothenburg, Sweden. Although he's Irish, he's a qualified barrister and has lectured all over the world on the topic of law. But he is also author of a fascinating book of scholarship and poetry called The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much for that introduction.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm delighted that you have come from so far to be with me.
And it's fantastic that I brought the snow as well from Gothenburg to Albuquerque.
We had a lovely walk in the snow this morning, and now we're going to talk about mysticism.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that.
Mysticism, well, to begin with, it means many different things to different people.
Well, when my interest in mysticism as an intellectual topic grew in recent years, so I come from a legal background, so obviously my academic interest in scholarship was interested in law, although that brought me to contiguous subjects. If you think of Oliver Wendell Holmes, for example, who was in the mystical or the metaphysical club with William James, he said that if your path is to law, it should take you through a whole load of other disciplines around it. I believe in that. So when I came to mysticism and I became personally interested, I began to look, after I began to write the poetry or in conjunction, at the range of views in academic scholarship and various views about the nature of mysticism, and to revisit mystics that I had been interested in and spiritual traditions and disciplines that had always fascinated me. So I began to try and people say, well, what is mysticism? And it's a difficult notion to define. And then we find there's a load of different academic disciplines, and within the disciplines there's various views. Some people argue for one view, other people argue for another view. So I said, okay, well, let's start at the start. And the analogy, I think that's what lawyers do. They try and look at the range of scholarship, the range of information, and look at the essential foundational aspects. And I think that's important. So I'm not claiming that I'm an academic in that discipline, so I have respect for them. But for me, mysticism has been about the essential question, the ubiquitous question, the meaning of life, and what is the meaning of life. More specifically, it's about a distrust that a certain type of people have about the nature of reality. This has been in all spiritual traditions, in all cultures. There's been a suggestion and a firm view to the effect that what we see around us and what we perceive with the senses is not the full extent of reality, or in some sense is not a true reflection of reality. So they have sought for various means through spiritual processes to access new realities. And we can see that in the shamanic traditions, we can see it in the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, we can see it in all the Oriental philosophies, we can see it in Buddhism, we can see it in Taoism, and there is a unifying view. So the first thing, it's about attempting to access a new reality which is beyond this reality. And when people do that, they often become skeptical about things we take for granted, about time and space, for example. But the key driving force for mysticism, it seems to me, is a struggle against existential despair. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? What are we doing here? And a constant search that people have for something else, some explanation. Now, usually it leads to gods or God or different super possibilities. But the phenomenon of mysticism is the same. There's a similar structure in all the traditions. And this is reflected in the perennial philosophy and ideas that there has been a universal philosophy, or in all different cultures, they come to the same results. So mysticism is about access to a different reality. Associate with that is an idea of the loss of self to find a higher self. Sometimes it can involve a distortion of time and space, a transcendence of time and space. Sometimes, or a fundamental idea as well, is that mysticism is about access to a sense of unity, that through a mystical process you can have a sense of unity with nature, with the world, with your fellow beings, or with spirits in a wider sense, not just about people who are living. So we see certain elements. The word mysticism, if we look at the etymology of it, as a lawyer would do, where does this word come from? We see that there are certain elements, usually going back to the Greek ideas, which imply, for example, that we're dealing with mysteries, and the link between mysticism and mystery is very, very close. It also implies some sense of initiation. So initiation is usually into some kind of secret doctrine or a higher order doctrine, and those are usually associated with accessing this extra reality. It could be simply about an inner path to enlightenment, the person that goes off to a cave to try and understand the meaning of life, the Buddha sitting under the tree, the Taoist going into the mountains, or people in their home beginning to think of what's happening. It could come from mystical events. So we know that the near-death experience is a classic mystical event. Now, if you have a mystical event, it doesn't mean that you will become a mystic, but the way I would explain it is there is a certain cycle or a spiral. You may have an event which sparks off your interest in spirituality, for example, and it makes it very, very personal. So we know that people who have been through a near-death experience, they come back with a greater sense of spirituality, a greater sense of their responsibility to other human beings and other beings, including animals, a greater sense of the impact of their conduct, that they're less interested in material goods or material philosophies, and it gives them a sense of comfort and peace. Sometimes the mystical quest is called the peace that passed all understanding. Mm-hmm. It's a sense that you get a sense of peace. Old people in Ireland used to talk about being at peace, having a sense of peace, and it was very important for them. If we think about it as an effort to combat existential despair, we see that people who have gone on a mystic journey are not afraid of death. They embrace life, and they don't always retreat to a cave and stay there. What they do, and if you look at the Christian mystics in particular, there's plenty of evidence from people like Evelyn Underhill, who wrote a great book on mysticism, and you're familiar with, of course, and she explained that the mystics start off with this questioning of reality, and they go in search of answers, but then they come back to society with something to offer. They have learned from their experience. So that's not the end. The cave is not the end of the journey, and that aspect is important. We see negative definitions of mysticism, so we have to be careful that there are plenty of people who say, oh, mysticism is something that happened in California, it's a new age phenomenon, it's hippies smoking dope and they're not interested in the real world. That's not true. That's a caricature of what the mystical experience is. I think Ayn Rand, for example, would give a hostile view of or definition of mysticism, and she would include all religion in mysticism, as far as I remember from her discussions. So mysticism is about that spiritual quest. It's about finding, identifying that you are a spiritual being, and then seeking to evolve as a spiritual being, because there's a lot of focus on natural selection and the scientific view of evolution, but actually I believe that our highest quest is to evolve spiritually. So you want to evolve spiritually, where do you look to? Well, if you're a Catholic, you should look to the Catholic mystical tradition, because otherwise the rituals may take out the real spiritual engagement and may become religion by rote, for example, and
which most mainstream religions seem to be. There seems to be a kind of tension in any given religion between the orthodox piety versus the mystical path within that faith.
That's right. And if you look at the origin of all religions, we see the mystic is there. So it's a very strange phenomenon that the religions are based on what I would define as a mystical quest and a mystical revelation. Revelation is another feature associated with mysticism. The idea that we can gain knowledge which is superior to existing rational methods through inspired ideas. Now that's a thought process that scientists have great difficulty with, despite the fact that most great inventors were open to spiritual influence. We know that a lot of Newton, for example, was very interested in the occult and in mysticism and in alchemy. So strangely, scientists say, no, well, that's nothing got to do with us. So there's a similar literal mindset from people in science as there is in religion. They share a great commonality. And there's a strange paradox that we've heard, young people hear a lot of debates about, say, for example, Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene. So what they do is they get a literalist scientist who espouses scientism against a literalist religious person. So what they're arguing about has nothing got to do with the spiritual quest. It's got to do with two versions of very narrow-minded literalist view, because in many senses, what's, for example, certain Christians espouse is not justified by evidence from Christian doctrine, from what Jesus Christ said. So they invent all kinds of doctrines and dogma which don't have any root in the original text. And there is a phenomenon that you notice, that the originators in the field come along, and then the less original people come along. They don't have the same motivation that drove the first, and then it freezes and it fossilizes. And it can be very difficult for people in the tradition to see a living spirit. But it's clear, and if you look at great perennial philosophers, for example, like Professor Syed al-Nasser, who has written a number of books, a great many texts on this. So he's an Islamic scholar, but he looks at the similarities between the spiritual quest in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, and they gain strength from each other because there is a parallel structure. And instead of seeking for the vision on doctrinal basis, to seek to fight over narrow and fine distinctions, the perennial philosophy, as advocated by Aldous Huxley in his book, for example, indicates that there is a parallel process. We gain by looking at the other traditions. And if you look at what some of the Buddhist teachers say, they say, well, if you're born a Catholic, you should look within your own tradition and explore that fully before you go looking for some exotic Oriental thing. That's important, because they learn off the traditions as well. And as one great Buddhist teacher said, why go look for footprints in the forest when you have the elephant at home? So I think that's a very good metaphor.
Well, you have suggested that one of the key core concepts involved in mysticism is to recognize yourself as a spiritual being.
Yeah, this is a primary question. You may find it difficult, and there may be a bit of a different emphasis in the United States, because we know that the United States has always been a religious country. And if we go back, of course, to the Native Americans, they have the greatest spiritual tradition in the world. And in the future, in the United States, I believe that the peoples of this land, the first peoples, the Navajo, who are not far from here, and I had the great fortune to stay on a reservation with the Ojibways, the Chippewa in Canada. They will be teaching us in the future, because they have retained spiritual traditions. But then with Christianity in the United States, we have great traditions of Quakerism, for example, which Quakerism is an interesting religion, because in Quakerism, there's a direct link between the spirit of the individual and God. So they accept the reality and of direct inspiration without an intervening institutional structure. So the problem is often with institutions. And I also think that we're going to go through a period of great skepticism about institutions. So we have had, in a number of different contexts, we have institutions which create a barrier between a person and an experience, and they can make it more difficult instead of facilitating. So.
Well, there's a strong sense, I think, that the mystical quest is an individual quest, a hero's journey that a person ultimately has to go on on their own. For example, Evelyn Underhill, whom you cited earlier, writes about the dark night of the soul.
Yes. The dark night of the soul is a specific element in the spiritual quest, as she notes certain phases in the tradition. And often, I suppose, the analogy is the darkest hour is before the dawn. It's a similar principle. But on the quest is not a happy quest in a way. It's a difficult quest. It requires discipline, perseverance, focus, willpower. But it is an individual quest, and this is where a conflict happens. We have, in a number of issues, if you look, we're not going to talk about politics, but in the political context you can think of as well. But in a number of contexts, there is a conflict between the individual and the group. And of course, we need networks to facilitate the individual. But there's a difference between a network which is facilitated in a community and a group which requires you to give up your sovereignty to it. That, in my view, is wrong, because even if you're a Catholic, you need to evolve within your own tradition, for example, or within Islam. You have to look at the great traditions that's there for the benefits of that personal individual journey. And for people that have no religion, my point is that there's similar processes that are there that can help one. You say, well, okay, where do I go from here? Do I take ayahuasca? Do I take DMT, for example? That's a big debate. You can hear, I don't know whether you ever listened to Joe Rogan as a podcast, but he has a fascination with DMT, for example. So I'm thinking about young people looking at that and saying, oh, okay, here is the answer, the spirit molecule. I take this and I have it. Well, I'm a bit skeptical about it. I'm not saying that doesn't work, and I'm certainly not saying that if you take it in the context of traditional indigenous knowledge with the shaman, for example, in South America, I'm not criticizing that at all. But there's a difference if you're taking it with people that have no experience of the culture where it comes from, and if you have had no spiritual path, and especially if you don't even believe that you have a spirit, because you may encounter things that you're not able to handle, for example. So that requires that you do the work, that there is a process of evolution before you get there. So it's a bit, we were talking earlier about Jack and the Beanstalk. If you think about the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, he gets the magic beans of the old lady who's really the goddess on the way to sell the cows at the market, and his mother will be mad with this. So she flings the beans out the window, and then we get this great big stalk. He climbs the stalk, and in the end he gets the treasures that are really his father's. There's a number of ways we can look at that. There's a big giant he has to contend with. You could look at it in one perspective and say, well, this represents the classic spiritual journey. You have to search for the gold. You have to go through the great journey, the great difficulties to recover the gold, because gold is traditionally a symbol for spiritual and mystical peace. As the rose, for example, is another symbol, and the rose garden is another symbol of the mystic spirit. So, in that sense, recovering the gold is a metaphor in some ways for the spiritual quest. Or you could also interpret it from another spiritual way and say, well, this is a bit like the problem with if you're taking certain hallucinogenic or entheogenic drugs or mushrooms, if you have no spiritual tradition, because you will encounter monsters and they could be damaging to you. You may not get the gold by that route. So the point is that if you begin to think in a spiritual way, you may come to different results. But certainly, it has to be an individual request or quest, and that reflects. I believe that Joseph Campbell's identification of the structure of myth is really about the process of spiritual evolution. It's really reflecting the model that is there.
Well, you're bringing up Jack and the Beanstalk as an example, suggests that in children's fairy tales, a lot of mystical wisdom is embedded.
My belief is that people talk about myth and they say, well, here's myth. And they say, what's the benefit of myth? Well, we can create a good story. And it's all about storytelling. Okay, that's certainly true. There's no doubt about that. But, and it's interesting if you read people like Christopher Booker, who has said that even that structure of story has changed in the last couple of 100 years. You won't get your happy ending. The hero is not necessarily a hero. And that is a mirror, a spiritual mirror of contemporary society in many respects. But you know that Bruno Bettelheim's book, The Uses of Enchantment, for example, if you look at Hansel and Gretel, it's an horrific story. I mean, you know, with everything, cannibalism, and I won't go through all the details in case there's children watching, but it's a brutal, it would be banned if you told it in its proper form. It's really, really brutal. But Bettelheim and other people argue that it's very important for development to understand these and to process, not to avoid these things, but to understand the process. So there has been a vogue from the time of Joseph Campbell to read myth, to put it together as a narrative. But I believe it's deeper. I think you have to go extra and say, well, actually, it's talking about the process of spiritual evolution.
Well, even nursery rhymes seem to deal with the dark side. And not long ago, I did an interview with a good friend about the filmmaker who's been an inspiration to me, Alejandro Jodorowsky, who I think is a spiritual filmmaker. And he made a point that you can't talk about spirituality without bringing in violence.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's a certain type of, now I'm not criticizing them, but there's a certain type of spiritual teacher which I don't listen to really when they present the spiritual quest as an effort in kind of compliance and of acquiescence and of being nice, and that's what it's about. Being spiritual is about being inoffensive. And if you look at a lot of the great spiritual, Martin Luther King, for example, is a great political, moral, spiritual leader. But he was interested in the mystery traditions, and I believe he was genuinely mystically inspired, and from there we get the power. There will always be a conflict. There is a great conflict between the growth of spirituality and the growth of the material world. It will always be there, and we have to deal with it. And it is a problem if we look at proper responses to violence, proper responses to political repression. We see that with Gandhi, for example. We see that the mystics tend towards non-violent solutions. We can see it. I'm not saying Daniel O'Connell was a mystic, but he did argue for the non-violent mass movement response, a mass of individuals, and he inspired Gandhi, for example, and he had close links with Frederick Douglass. But violence is there. The reality is that spiritual people have to tend towards their own evolution. And then they have to convince other people that it's a valuable journey, that we're not just here for a short space of time, and that our actions have consequences. And violence is the most evident example of an ultra simple solution to a particular context that causes great ramifications in the future. So even my father was born in 1918. So imagine, that was the First World War was going on. It's quite incredible. Well, it shows you it's not that long ago. So with the centenary of the First World War, I was waiting for the great explanations. Well, this is why it happened. We've discovered that was this reason. But nothing was added, in my view. Nothing explained this mass slaughter of people, and that has continued since. It's continued in Stalinist Russia and the Second World War, the Holocaust, etc. We know all about this.
I mean, that's part of our legacy on this planet is that we have centuries of violence.
Yeah. And I believe that if you make the commitment to materialism instead of without spirituality, it will lead to that result. Whatever extreme you come from, if your basis is the material world, you will have material solutions which are often violent to the problems. And there's a vicious circle and a cycle of momentum that will perpetuate them. So they do go together. Mahatma Gandhi, without his mystical experience, without his investigation of the different traditions, wouldn't have been able to present an argument. So they do go together.
Let me suggest an alternative, though, about the relevance of violence on the mystical quest. It has to do, I think, with the notion of initiation. The notion, as I understand it from the writings of Rudolf Steiner, a mystical teacher, there's a point in everyone's life when they're on the path where they have to confront their own dark side. I think that's what the dark night of the soul is looking at those violent impulses that exist within us, because after all, we're primates. And
yes. There's 2 points to that. The dark night of the soul can also be a phase where you have experienced something of the higher order and are afraid that you won't get more of. There's a kind of, I've experienced something, and so there's a bit of like the ambivalence with people who come back after near-death experience.
Yeah.
I've got that, but here I'm back in this reality, and how do I manage here? Now, my view of that is that if we think the idea of the sea as the spirit and the land as the material world, we have to be amphibious. We have to be able to operate in both zones, or we have to be able to master the foreshore and master this, or commune with the sea or commune with the land as appropriate. But they are 2 different dimensions. So the mystics say that there are 2 different dimensions in that sense. So the dark night of the soul, certainly it could have that perspective. But for me, the spiritual evolution requires you deal with the ego. So I'm certainly not sitting here saying I have mastered the ego. I'm an enlightened being. I'm not saying, but I am very aware that we have to deal with the ego. But that doesn't mean that we say, abolish your ego, become a nothing, become a jellyfish. It doesn't mean that. It means that you work on your ego. And in fact, most mystic leaders have an incredibly strong ego. It's bulletproof, but they have to develop that. But they develop it by simplifying, by discarding elements which are unwanted. And we can see this metaphor in alchemy. One of the key people forget that alchemy was a spiritual quest. So one of the key ideas was about distillation. So when you distill the raw material, you get spirit at the end, often, like in the alcoholic context, and you have discarded that which is not essential. In many ways, this is the analogy to the true spirit, the consciousness that we have when we're born, that I believe is pre-existing, which is another issue. So, yes, we have to deal with the ego, and there is an effort. We can see this in Vedantic philosophy. The idea that we have, and I share this view, that there's a true self and a kind of false self. And by turning inwards, you see the true self, the true consciousness, which is not determined by your identity. It's not confined to Jeff or to Mishlove or to all the things you've done or to Berkeley or parapsychology or quest for. It's not confined to that. It's beyond that, and it's transcendent. So yes, a key part, the starting point, is dealing with the ego, and that also raises an interesting question about what if you get ego or big ego and big powers associated, and that's a volatile domain.
Well, many people get on a spiritual quest and they discover that they do acquire powers, and that only feeds the ego.
Yeah, there's 2 points. If you look at, and they're right on this, a lot of Buddhist teachers say that when you come to you acquire higher powers because of your concentration, your will, they will come, but they're not important. They can become distractions as well. So they are not the object. They are just a feature on the journey. They're just a place you pass by. Some of them may be relevant because we can see in the Catholic tradition, those powers we can see, for example, if I can think of Saint Clara, who had powers. She's the patron saint of television because she could be in two places at once. When she was sick once, she couldn't visit, but she sent a double of her to the present. So she was seen to be a useful metaphor for television. So the point is that the Catholic tradition, and they have often scrupulously investigated these cases, as Michael Murphy has
very rigorous investigation.
The founder of the Asylum Institute has focused on his work. So they've investigated and they've found that these powers, and they're often seen to be associated with miracles or higher powers. Some of them can be there, some of them inspire, but they can also grow. But the thing is not to focus on them. So, and here is the difference between certain types of magic and certain types of mysticism. The link between mysticism and magic is very close. A lot of people are interested in magic say, well, they're totally different and they want a division. But if you look at the history of magic and mysticism, they're indistinguishable. Certain paths have gone their different ways. And if you look at figures like John Dee, who was Elizabeth I's magician, if you like, he would have been accomplished in the domains of mathematics, science, linguistics, philosophy, alchemy, magic, and politics.
Yes.
So he would have seen them all, although he believed in God in some shape or form. There was no contradictions between these things. And if you look at early Christian Ireland, the coming of Christianity was associated with the Christians being able to demonstrate superior magic to the Druids' magical tradition. Whatever way they did it, there's a suggestion that early Catholicism and Christianity was more comfortable with some of these powers that are developed through mystical tradition. And there was a particular brand of Christianity that grew up in Ireland, which was more associated with nature, which is more associated with contemplation, and with more open to animals and nature. It was different, and associated with early monasticism.
Well, there are many forms of mysticism. There's a mysticism of the intellect, the mysticism of service, the mysticism of compassion and love. I'm under the impression from your work that you really put compassion at the center.
I think that for me, the essence of the mystical quest is compassion. So I'm sticking to that as the central value. So I'm not interested in mysticism that promises something else. I'm not interested in mysticism that promises you material wealth in this world. That would be a strange contradiction. And I'm certainly not interested in darker forms of mysticism which are associated with negative things. So if you look at the essence of Christianity or in Islam or in Buddhism or in Taoism, there is an essential compassion. It's not a kind of weak compassion. Oh, I feel sorry for you, Jeffrey. It's not like that. It's a deeper thing from the heart, because some of the other types of compassion are substitutes from the brain, and they're unsatisfactory in that sense. The idea of compassion has to be related to the heart, and it's an idea that must be brought to that level. So the heart is a fundamental aspect of the spiritual quest, and locating the attention to the heart. So compassion is critical. If in the other mystical quests you're promised something else, well, that's not one I'm interested in. I'm not saying that it's not a type of mysticism. I describe it as a dark mysticism, where dark is the opposite to light. So in the traditions, and that's why it's important to be careful. It's important to be careful for younger people, especially. I'm sounding like a very old man here, but for younger people, when they're told about the interesting things about the occult and about seances and Ouija board, they're dealing with very dangerous things. If you look at people who are informed on the spiritual path, you can't really play about with those things. They're not things to be toyed with. So we have to be careful. And there's a similar problem in relation to psychedelics and hallucinogenics. We have to be careful. There's a tendency for I understand that for younger people, they want a buzz, they want a shortcut, they want a buzz, they want something quick. But really, the compassionate path is a slower one. But if you look at people, for example, who have had a near-death experience, and some people, and people as well who take DMT or ayahuasca or psilocybin, their compassion can be opened up that way. So I'm not saying that it can't be. There's this, but I wouldn't start with that. But yes, the compassion, the heart path is the center, and you can't look at the life of any of the great mystics without seeing that compassion. So therefore, as well, if they are the person who is driven by that compassionate heart is not going to be led by the head. They're not going to get obsessed with technical issues. They're not going to be obsessed with details or fine distinctions that will interfere with that. And that's where the difference...
Theological disputes.
Yes. So often the literalists take over and we get a very literal view. The mystic should be committed to broad principles in relation to what's the most compassionate thing. It doesn't mean that they discard discipline, that they discard distinctions, they don't discard theology. But if you look within the Catholic Church, a lot of the orders which grew up, which were very rich and enriched the church, were people who had kind of broken away. They had said, well, I don't like this, something in the tradition which is not satisfying me. And I have stayed with monks in Ireland, for example, and they have a different perspective. They've gone a different path. You will find, I've stayed at Beanstalk Abbey, for example, in Ireland, and it was interesting, the people that were there, met some interesting people there. And the monks are often very open. They're open to other ways of looking. In fact, I remember that the Abbot Hederman, he's quite well known in Ireland, and he had a seminar on the tarot. People like him are taking a cosmopolitan perspective, so they're not being very doctrinal. They're being open and respectful to other ways of looking at things, which is essentially a pragmatic view. Well,
that raises a question, though, of what is the definition of compassion? I'm under the impression, if we go back to your original thought, that one of the main values of mysticism is as an antidote to existential despair.
Yeah.
That first and foremost, one needs to have compassion for oneself.
You have to start off with yourself. Essentially, one has to... example is the best teacher. So, for example, in your personal journey, there's foundational issues or foundational context that I can see. The idea of being present, for example, is a very important idea. So you have found that yourself. You're driven to that. You're inspired to focus on that issue. And through that, you have created a pathway. And that pathway has created a legacy that other people, you've created a garden that other people can access through the amount of interviews you've done. Going back to, it's incredible that you've interviewed people like Terence McKenna and Francis Crick and Robert Anton Watson and great Nobel laureates and people that are investigating the fringes of science, psychedelics. So you've done that, and interest in people who are like the PK man, for example. So you've become a teacher in that sense. So your personal journey has given the point about the hero that goes away. They bring back something. Whether people want it or not is up to them. The point about the mystic journey is the same. The mystic goes out on the quest. Through their own personal quest, they come back with something. It doesn't mean that people follow it. Martin Luther King says it doesn't matter what your religion is, and he wants to see he could see the Catholic children and the Protestant children playing together, etc., in the future, in the red hills of Georgia, black and white, irrespective. It doesn't matter, because people like that see beyond superficial identifications. So my point would be that example is the teacher, and your work has manifested that. You can tell something, people, but if you don't walk the walk, if you don't demonstrate it, and also I do think that you have to think about what compassion is, and there is a wider sense of compassion that people who have had mystical experiences report. And that is about understanding more. So it's about breaking down limitations on their own perception. So in some ways, it's about comprehension, and associate with that is feeling, and about being able to identify. So in the Catholic context, you have St. Francis understanding animals and having an affinity with animals. We see that in Irish Christianity as well. So it's a wider sense of perception of beings, similar to Oriental views. So the compassion is not, oh yes, you've suffered that, I feel sorry for you, I'm going to help you. That's not the end of it. The compassion is based on accepting yourself as a spiritual individual and accepting the other person as a spiritual individual who needs often spiritual comfort. And to give you an example, if you look at Christopher Hitchens, who's a very clever man.
Famous atheist.
Famous atheist. He used to be a Trotskyist, as he said. Whether he always used to be is another debate. And he's a very clever man who persuaded a lot of people with powers of persuasion and a certain kind of bullying demeanor. So the people that he would see as very bad people were people like Mother Teresa. He says, well, she wasn't interested in poverty. And there's a clear example. People like Mother Teresa would see their work as spirit to spirit. And whereas people like Hitchens has a materialistic view of the world. So they're only going to interpret goodness, compassion on material basis. You come to different places. Spiritual comfort is very important. And the meaning of life, if we take Viktor Frankl, and his statement that if everything else has been taken away from you, the only thing you have left is the power to decide how you react to the situation, whether positively or not. And that betrays a spiritual disposition, because you often ask how people endured great hardship, and how people, even in great hardship, could sometimes smile, laugh, dance in horrendous situations. And the spiritual path promises more than the material world in that sense. And I think it's important. But you do come to different places.
Well, it strikes me that what we're getting at here is the kind of tension that exists between the realization of ourselves as spirit, which to me means like the ground of being, something that connects us all, independent of our life story.
Yes.
Completely. Yeah. And at the same time, we don't lose our life story.
Spirit is an insufflation of cosmic consciousness. So the question is, well, one, do you believe you have a spirit? And it's interesting, if you ask people the question, they begin to say, well, I don't know, or maybe I do, or do I have because this is the feature of the modern age. Yeah. Now, scientists will say, of course you have to prove it. But from a legal perspective, I would argue that the presumption throughout history has been that we are spiritual beings. That has there throughout all of history. And with the Enlightenment, which is a kind of perversion of the idea of enlightenment, which is a thing that they do quite a bit. They take a spiritual concept and they turn it into a secular version, which doesn't deliver the goods as much. But it's a kind of magic trick that they do, an illusory trick. So the Enlightenment offered through scientific means doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you get the enlightenment offered through a path of spiritual evolution.
But the idea of, how do you
insufflation.
say? Insufflation.
So, if you have a spirit, then the question is, well, where did the spirit come from? My belief, and I share it with a few scientists these days, is that consciousness is fundamental. We know that the principle that consciousness is fundamental has been realized, particularly by quantum physicists, and that consciousness may be the element which is in nature, which is there, which is pervasive. And in some ways, I would argue that the spirit is a kind of quantum of, I'm not using the quantum physics because I'm not talking about the scientific terms, but by analogy, that we are a measure of consciousness which comes into being here and the purpose of it is to evolve. So insufflation means to blow into. So spiritual consciousness, I believe, comes into us. Now, this is consistent with notions of reincarnation, but even in Christian terms, you have to say, where did the soul or spirit come from? And early Christians seem to have been opened to different ideas and certain ideas within. There were certain groups. It wasn't as monolithic as it seems to be afterwards. They were open to reincarnation, and we can look at the various sects that existed who had different conceptions, wider conceptions. If you look at the Gospel of St. Thomas and the Gospels that are not accepted to be in the canon, they are far more similar to Vedantic philosophy, for example. We can see the parallels. They're in many ways more acceptable to, more understandable to people who are less literalistic. So I think there's a mistake to be too dogmatic about what the canon is.
But I think when I read your use of the term insufflation, it had more to do with the here and now. It had to do with taking our life, our historical persons who had a birth and a death and parents and a career and a life history, and allowing consciousness, pure consciousness, the ground of being, the ultimate transcendent awareness to fill our history.
Human rights developed on the basis of certain principles, which were often Judeo-Christian principles. And the same in the Islamic world. They grew, the legal principles grew from a base which was revelatory. So if you begin to take, C.S. Lewis pointed this out, that if you take away the claim to a higher dimension as the source of your laws, you will end up with objectives which will end up with the fascism or extreme communism, which will deny the rights of the individual. Now, scientists are in danger of making the same mistake. They say, well, we can prove that free will is non-existent. We can prove that consciousness it doesn't exist. You know, some of the people say that.
Yeah, well, I interviewed Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of cybernetics, who said to me on video, it's still available, you should be proud of being no more than a piece of meat.
Yeah, well, my kids now are into various comics and films, you know, all the X-Men, all the Marvel, all that. So it's through all those. It's interesting through all the comics. I've gone back and
mystical stories.
Well, look at Doctor Strange.
Yeah,
I've looked at them again. Where sometimes, if you appreciate the mystical journey, well, then you can go back and say, hold on a second, this is filling. So you see it in Doctor Strange. Yeah. You see it in Batman. But another interesting thing is, we see the mad scientist. Mm-hmm. It's ubiquitous. Yeah. The mad scientist.
Lex Luthor.
There's loads of them. I have a big long list of them. So they're mad scientists. So these imaginative
the intellect
people,
getting carried away with itself.
And the ego. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and here's the thing. If you look back at, in biblical terms, now I know the devil can cite scripture for his purpose, as they say in The Merchant of Venice, I think, but if you look back at Genesis, and there's don't eat the apple from the tree of knowledge. And you say, well, that's a difficult thing. Well, why not? Knowledge is not, the tree of life, and there's a conflict.
Yes.
And it's oversimplified. My view of that is that the suggestion, whether you want to call it a myth, a metaphor, a lesson, a parable, whatever, or if you want to take it as a literal truth, whatever, you still have to interpret what that means. And my view is that the suggestion there was that you have a path, you have a quest for knowledge, and you have a quest for spiritual evolution. I believe that it's the same story. And the suggestion is that if you say, well, knowledge is what I want, knowledge is what I want, the point is that knowledge is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and it will never be satisfied. Knowledge will always be knowledge of something else, and we have Gödel's incompleteness theorem, will never be satisfied. So I hear people like Donald Hoffman is very interested in his views of consciousness, and it seems to me that it mirrors the spiritual traditions. But I'm a bit skeptical about people now that scientists are coming to take the lessons, because they can appropriate it without the means. So he's talking very coherently and accurately about mathematical models which will prove certain elements in his theory, But there'll always be another mathematical model which is necessary. And we don't live on mathematical models alone.
He's the one who suggests that our consciousness is not an accurate reflection of reality, that it's more like the icons we see on our computer screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'll have to say, with respect to him, he's not original in that. He may be original in the, I don't mean any offense, he's fantastic man and very interesting, and I have listened to a lot of his talks. But so he says that what happens through the process of evolution is that we get certain icons which represent reality. So it's similar to ideas you have in the Matrix. It's very similar to Gnostic teachings. It's very similar. This is not the real world. But that's the essence of mysticism. Mysticism has always said, this is not the true reality. He makes some interesting points about that. He says, when you run loads of models through computers with loads of different scenarios about creature or entities in this context who see reality as it truly is, he said they become extinct. So I can understand the point. So you might say, well, why do we want to see different reality? But that's not the point. We want to see certain aspects of reality which are important for spiritual evolution. And I'm concerned that if you say that we're just conscious agents, I agree that it's a very accurate description of what's going on, but I don't trust scientists. Because scientists, unfortunately, I'm not saying about him, I have great respect for him, great contribution and all, but you have to accept that within the institution of science, talking about institutions, there are plenty of people who are guns for hire, for example. You can give the research money, they'll get the results, and also they get money because they want a product and they want to be able to monetize it in some way. And that's a danger because you might extract the good stuff and...
So you're pointing to a kind of conflict between science and mysticism.
For me, there's a big conflict. Now, there's a huge conflict. I believe that mysticism has come to a lot of valuable insights that science is now beginning to say, hold on a second, this is useful here. They have stuff that they have learned. So we can learn off them and extract from them and utilize it. Because scientists talk about, knowledge, increase in knowledge, as if they had no personal interest, as if they didn't profit from the thing itself. So we can't, scientists, in many ways, they're ethical free in some sense. They don't care that they will focus on their curiosity and bring it to wherever it came to. Like H.G. Wells, when he wrote his book anticipating the atomic bomb, he believed that when the atomic bomb went off, which he kind of predicted, the scientists would come together and rule the world because people would be too afraid. But scientists will go on to continue for the next thing. If you look at nanotechnology, for example, we'll have the problem before we begin to discuss the ethical context. Yeah. And, for example, all the problems now that they come along with solutions for, they fail to see that they have been part of the cycle of creating those problems. Because many mystics in our spiritual life, they wouldn't have invested so much effort in the facilitation of material things. So scientists are very good at criticizing other institutions, like Dawkins criticizing religion, and then taking no responsibility themselves for things they have created. They don't see, and especially you can understand how that would be the case if they don't have any idea of what right and wrong is.
Well, I know that I'm a parapsychologist. That is technically a science. I think it's very intimately related to mysticism. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm here to check you out. I'm investigating to see whether you're a hostage. I'm not really. But there is a question in parapsychology, and you have made this distinction. I've learned a lot from looking at your various programs because it's a great source of information in relation to parapsychology and spirituality. But take the example of remote viewing. Yeah. So we can approach remote viewing there's many mystics, many Buddhists, practitioners who can be in different places, who can see things from afar, who can remote view. And then there are people who are not mystical, who have those, or can develop those same powers. Now, I'm not saying that they're not mystical or not spiritual, but there's two different groups. So science can come along and appropriate elements or confine it to that context.
And undoubtedly it will.
It will do, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a great conundrum here. There's a point at which a philosophical question about what happens if, say, your legacy is a free resource, a garden for science to mine, and I'm not saying this happened, but you understand the point that science says, well, parapsychology is pseudoscience, doesn't even recognize it, but it's going to be very willing to appropriate the benefits. Yeah. And I'm sure, as you have anticipated, that in future they will have a lot more respect for it, because the methodology is often better in parapsychology because they have to be better. And you can see, like, the Institute of Noetic Science, and that they're very, very diligent about the scientific methods they use to. But they often, and what is interesting when you look at those scientists, and I know I listened to a lady, I can't remember her name, talking about quantum physics here with you recently, and she came from
Ruth Kastner.
Yes, exactly. And I was impressed with when a scientist has humility about things that they don't, because they should be. They always say, oh, we need proof for things, but sometimes they can be arrogant. But when you have that humility, that gives me hope for the future.
I'm discovering from this conversation is that this is like the never-ending story.
Exactly, yeah. Well, you're talking to an Irishman, and so my objective here is to bewilder you. So yeah, it is, but it is. But I think, as you talk about it, you begin to come to certain themes, and and sometimes it's necessary to revisit the point to emphasize it.
That's why we keep doing new programs.
Yeah.
Well, James Tunney, this has been a delight. I'm very happy that you're here with me in Albuquerque. We're going to have many more conversations before you leave. I think our viewers will be quite surprised at some of the topics we cover. So thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.